Are you ready for the climax of the course? Of course you are. So in the next 2 lessons, we're going to be building this wrangler rig. This is all what we've been working towards, and hopefully it's going to teach you enough to be able to do the same on your own characters. So what we're focused on in this course is just a basic rig. We're going to get it moving. There's no fancy bits, there's no IK, FK switching or anything like that. This is just the basic bare bones version of making your character move, which is always really exciting the first time that you can achieve this. You're like, I did it, this is amazing. I've broken that whole tutorial up into 2 parts, but unlike the crane rig where we have certain checkpoints to kind of watch and catch up to, this one has lots of steps. So you will need to decide when you pause the video to catch up, but I suggest just taking some notes on the steps that I'm doing. I have each step I've got labeled on the screen what step I'm doing now, the previous step, and the next step. So you can kind of take notes and do that, but it's up to you to pause when you think you're going to take on the next little chunk. So try and watch what I'm doing and think about it kind of as a bigger picture. Don't just try and copy what I'm doing without thinking about it. Go kind of zoom out and go, oh, he's building the legs. I kind of know what he's doing. So don't just follow along. I want you to think along with me. Now, the order in which I'm doing things, first we're going to be building the deformation rig, but I'm not going to be putting the DEF on the names of the bones because there's quite a lot of bones and we have to type def out 1,000 times. I'm just going to name the bones and then use the batch rename to add that. That's just kind of a step that I do to save myself a whole bunch of typing. But we're going to focus on the deformation bones first, and then we're going to build each component from the ground up, starting with the root, then work on the legs, and then work on the spine and the head and the arms. We're going to build widgets for them as we go along, and then we're going to symmetrize our work to the other side. So you only have to do half the character. Don't work harder than you need to. Are you ready to get into this? Of course you are. All right, so I'm going to remind you again, don't just follow along, think along with me. Let's go. This is the starting file for our project we're going to be working on today. It includes the Wrangler model, which was modeled by yours truly. I'm quite proud of this. Even though I'm not a modeler, I am a rigger and an animator. I wanted to show you that you don't need a great model to be able to rig, although it does help if the model is good. I'm actually quite proud of my modeling work here. I said to Kent, look out, I'm coming for your job. And then 10 minutes later, he sent this. So that was a real stay in your lane moment for me. I guess I'm not a modeler after all. But I digress. Let's have a look at the structure of this file. Most of the structure is already there in the outliner. You can see the mesh is broken up into 4 separate components. Some of these will just be straight bone parented, but the body mesh is going to be the one that we're working the most on. That's going to get the armature modifier. And all of these origin points are at 0, 0, 0. This is in case you accidentally shift them, which is something you do when you're a beginner. You accidentally move objects all the time. If you do, you can just reset them back to 0 and they're going to be in exactly the right spot. All right, that's the file intro done. Let's get to work. All right, the first thing we're going to do is add our armature with all the familiar things that we've already done. So we're going to turn on in front. We're going to turn it to wire, set the bone names to be on, as well as show our axes. Then we can name that object as well as the data and make sure it's also in the right collection, which is our rig collection. And then I'll start with the spine bone. These are all going to be the deformation bones first. So I'll jump into edit mode and I'll also turn on the wireframe for my geometry. That way I can see where the loops are going to be. But I'll position the head of the bone at the bottom of that torso tube, right at the bottom there. And then the top is going to be at the start of the neck. I can then subdivide that and scale it down. That'll be the first section. That'll be the hip bone. And once I'm happy with that size, I'm going to subdivide the top bone and make sure that the chest is a little bit bigger because that's the area I want to stay more solid. And then I can name all of those bones in the spine. That will be the hips, the spine, and the chest. Now I'm going to add my leg. I'm going to position it at the top there and rotate it so that the Z axis is pointing backwards. So that's going to help us out a little bit later on. But I can extend the tail all the way down to the position of the ankle. And before I split that, I want to make sure that the bone is in the center of that geometry. So I'm just going to move it slightly. And then I want to extend the top a little bit further into the torso of the character, but not too far. Now I will subdivide that leg and push the knee slightly forward so that the IK constraint knows which way to bend. And then I can extrude out the foot, but I'll make sure that I change my snapping over to vertex and then constrain it at one axis at a time. And when you look at it from the front, you can see that these feet are perfectly straight. That is so much better for animation. Trust me, And the last thing I'll do is name all of those bones we just added. That's the thigh.L, shin.L, and the foot.L. Don't forget to add the .L. And this is what it's looking like at the moment. The next bit is the shoulder. I'm just going to duplicate that chest bone for now and recalculate the roll to global Z so that the Z axis is pointing up. Then I'm looking at where the head of the bone is going to be. It doesn't need to be right in the center of the character, but near the middle of that bulk of the chest will do. I'm going to scale down so that the tail of the bone is where the upper arm is going to start. And that'll be the middle of that bulky shoulder area. And I did just shift it all up a little bit, but I will shift it back down later. But it's time to name that bone. That's going to be shoulder.L. And now I'm just kind of testing where it's going to rotate from and imagining that geometry rotating around the head of that bone. And I think it's pretty close for now. I'm moving on to the arm bones. So I'll roughly mark out where the joints are going to go. So the shoulder, the elbow, and then the hand. That's where I'm going to put the wrist joint. And now I'll extrude one bone from the shoulder and go all the way to the wrist, and then extrude one more bone out for the hand. And this is when I decide that I want to shift all those bones downwards so they're more in the center of that arm tube. At the moment, it's too close to the top. And I could have also lowered the shoulder at the same time as well. Then I'm going to jump to the top view and subdivide that bone and pull the elbow joint backwards a little bit. And then I'm giving it a good look from all angles. And then from the front, I decide I need to scale the upper arm a little bit bigger. So I'm happy with that. So I will name all of my bones. That's the arm upper.L and the forearm.L, and of course the hand.L. Now I will add 2 more bones for the neck and the head. I can just extrude from the chest because that's already in the middle of the character. I want the neck to go straight up, but slightly into the head area, but not too far. And then I can extrude that head bone one more time, all the way to the top of the head geo. Now it's not important how big this head bone is, but it's just more of a visual thing. And then I can name those 2 bones, head and neck. And we are done with all of the deformation bones because technically the hat is not going to deform. It's just going to be parented straight to a control bone later on. I'll deal with that later. And the same with the moustache and the hair. That's going to be parented to the head bone as well. The next step is I'm going to check all of the bone rolls. But before I do that, I'm going to change everything over to Euler XYZ. Now for our limbs, we won't actually have any FK control, so the bone roll isn't super important, but it is a good habit to start thinking about this now at the fundamentals level. I want the main rotation to be on the X axis. So if the Z axis is pointing backwards on the legs, that's going to be nice for us. And the Z can be down on the foot because technically we're not going to touch that in animation. It's going to be parented to a control bone. With our spine, if the Z axis is pointing forward, that's going to make the main rotation on the X-axis, and that's good for us. So Z-axis forward on the spine, and that's going to be the same all the way up the spine to the head. For the shoulder, I have already pointed the Z-axis up, so that's already good for us. But for the arms, as I said, we're not technically going to have any FK controls. We're just using IK, but I do want to get into the habit of pointing the Z-axis backwards. That way, the main rotation is going to bend the elbow on the X rotation. And for animation, that is the nicest angle for that. But as I said, in this rig, we're only using IK, so that step is really optional. Now we're going to batch rename all of these bones to add the DEF to the front before we do the symmetrize. Now I did it in that order, so we didn't have to type DEF 1000 times. But that's all of our deformation bones done. We're going to move on to binding the mesh to the armature now. So I'm only going to bind the main body section, and so I'll hide everything else. But you already know how to bind. We're going to select the mesh, then the armature, hit Control P, and we're going to choose automatic weights and then clean it up at a later stage. I'm giving it a little bit of a test to see if it's working. It's good in some areas and really bad in others, but it's working. I did forget to hide the hair, so I'll just hide that now. You will notice that my parenting isn't correct either. I will fix that in a later stage so those arms actually stay connected to the body. But for the next bit, we need to add some more bones. So I'm going to add the root bone next. So just add the bone at the origin and rotate it so it aligns with the world and just scale it down a little bit. Also, don't forget to name it, and then I can duplicate that bone and use it for our torso control. So I'm going to drag that one up to the middle of the character, roughly to where the shirt starts. And don't forget to name that torso bone as well. Then I will add a foot.L control. So I'm going to duplicate the root bone again because it's already aligned to the world. I'll scale it down and name it. And then I'll jump to local view and snap it to the ankle joint from the front view, and that's where it's going to stay. Now I do symmetrize that foot across to the other side, but I'll need to do that again after the constraint, so it's not necessary at this stage. I do turn on X-axis symmetry as well at this point, but that's not necessary as well because I am going to symmetrize. But the next step is to parent the thighs to the hips and also parent the shoulders to the chest bone. One more optional step is to disconnect the arm and the neck by hitting Alt-P and choosing disconnect. That's leaving the parenting intact, but it's just unchecking that connected option. It's not necessary for this character, but if you're adding bendy bones in the future, this is probably a good habit to get into. You will learn more about that in a later course. And then there's a few more parenting steps. We need to parent the feet and the torso both to the root control. So I'm selecting them and then the root last and parenting that with keep offset, obviously. And then I can parent that deformation foot to the foot control. Time to add some IK constraints to our legs. So I'm going to add the constraint on the end of the chain. That's going to be our shin bone. So I'll select the target, which is the foot, then the shin, and add that constraint. And the first thing I'm going to do is change the chain length. Otherwise, it's going to totally break my character. So now this is working, but you'll see that the knee is super wonky. So I'm going to add a few more bones to control that knee. So let's jump into edit mode for that. Just going to extrude a bone from the knee straight forward, and that's going to be my vis bone. And then I'll extrude the actual pole target the other direction, so it's world aligned. I'll just pull that out a little bit further, so it's just slightly further away from the knee. And then I can name those new bones. So the big long one's going to be the vis knee, and the one at the end is actually going to be our pole target, so knee pole.L. And then I forgot that I had X symmetry turned on, so I'm just going to delete the other side for now. Those names are out of sync, so I can do that, and just turn it off, and I'll resymmetrize later after I've done all the constraints. So let me parent those new bones that we created. The vis bone is going to be parented to the def thigh, which it already is, but I'm just making sure. And then I want to parent the knee pole target to the foot control. That's going to be the easiest for us to control in animation. Let's make our vis stretch all the way to our pole target. It just helps you see what is connected to what. So I just add a stretch to constraint on that guy. And then we're jumping back to the IK constraint to add that pole target. So I can just fill in the extra information, and you'll notice that the knee is now pointing in the wrong direction, but we know how to fix that. We need to change the pole angle to -90 degrees. Now we can test everything to see if it's working, and it is. So I will reset everything and then symmetrize all that leg work across to the other side. Now things are getting a little bit difficult to see, so I'm going to add some widgets just to help keep things tidy and neat. So the first one I'm going to add is a root widget. With the foot widget, I'll start with a rounded plane and snap it to the ground and shape it. And I like to pull up the back section just so it's easier to select from the side. And then I'll add a line for those vis bones and a pyramid shape for the knee targets. And this is what our widgets look like at the end of this stage. Now I'm going to add some spine controls to our character here. So I'll do that in edit mode, and I can select the 3 bones that are there already and duplicate them. And I will add these to a collection called torso, but later on I do all the collections properly. I'm going to turn on the names so you can see what I'm doing, but I'm going to rename these controls just by removing all of the stuff from the start, the DEF, and all of the junk from the end. So I'm going to call this bottom one the hips or the pelvis, doesn't really matter what you call it. And then I'll use the battery name to strip that extra stuff off the other ones at once. Now the top 2 controls are going to stay how they are, but I do want to flip the hip control just by hitting Alt F, and that's going to change the direction. Okay, now I'll do a little bit of parenting. I need to parent the hip control to the torso, and I need to parent the deformation hips to that new hip control. So that's the bottom of the spine chain to that new control. I will make the deformation spine copy the transforms of the spine control. It's a little bit difficult to see what I'm doing because they're all over the top of each other. I will add an extra stretch on that one too in a moment. But I'm going to do the same on the chest where the deformation version, I want that to copy the transforms of the control version. And then I want to disconnect the bone parent so that I can move it around freely. I can just hit Alt P and then disconnect that bone. That doesn't remove the parenting, it just unchecks the connected option. Here's where I add that stretch to constraint on the deformation spine. So it stretches all the way to the chest control. So select the target, then the owner, and add the stretch to constraint. And I will also disable the maintain volume on that so it doesn't get skinny and fat when we stretch the torso. Now we have a little bit of wiggle room on our chest. So I can add some widgets now to keep things nice and tidy. I'm going to add a rounded plane for the torso and then circles for the hips and the spine. And for the chest widget, I'm just actually going to use a chest widget, and I can tweak the size of that to make it match. And that is my widgets done. Now I'm giving it a test and I realized I've missed some of the parenting. So that spine control needs to be parented to the torso control. And then you'll notice that not everything is moving along, so I need to disconnect the deformation spine as well. So it's not removing the parent, just unchecking the connected option to its existing parent. And now the spine is working the way that I want. We're going to work our way up the body now and move on to the head and the neck controls. So I'll jump into edit mode and I can just duplicate what is there. I will move them to the torso collection, but really I'm being a little bit lazy with the names of all these collections. I can clean up those bone names to get rid of all the stuff that I don't need. And then I want to world align that head. You might think I'm crazy, but this is going to make animation easier. And then we'll add some widgets to those bones. That's going to be a circle for the neck. And with the head, I'm going to start with that saddle shape and then tweak it from there. But I do want to make sure that the widget looks okay when his hat is visible. So I turn on all the other geometry and check out what it looks like before I finalize my shape. But I turn them back off again when I'm finished. Right, now I want to parent that neck control to the chest. And I'm also going to add a stretch 2 constraint on the deformation neck that's going to target the head bone, the control version of that bone. And I do want to disable the maintain volume on that one. And the deformation version of the neck can just be parented straight to that neck control. That's how I'm going to get it to follow along. I'll do the same thing with the head version. The deformation head will just be parented straight to the head control. And then I want to uncheck the connected option on the head control so that I can move it around freely and it's not attached to the neck. I'm giving that a little bit of a test and it's working the way that I want. So I'm going to move on to the shoulder control. For this, I'm just going to duplicate and rename what is already there. And then I'm going to parent that bone to the chest, the control version. I will give it a name. Thankfully, there is a shape called clavicle. And then I want to parent the deformation version of the shoulder to the control version. And when one side is done, I can symmetrize that across to the other side. Now I'm going to move on to the IK arms. Now before we do the IK constraint, we're going to add the extra bones that we did exactly like the legs. So I'll extrude the vis bone back, and then I'll extrude the elbow pole from this one as well. I don't need to reverse this one. I can name all of those bones that I've just added, and then I will duplicate the hand to create the IK version of the hand, or the control version, just hand.l. And I want to parent that IK hand to the chest. This is what I call local IK. It's the best for beginners. So you still get the IK motion, but it's going to follow along with the chest. And I'll use the relationship panel for the parenting, just because I think it'll be easier to select the right bone. I'll do the same thing with the elbow pole. I want to parent that one to the chest. Although for this one, I should have unchecked connected before I did that. I didn't snap all the way over there. I want to add the IK constraint on the forearm. So I select the hand and then the forearm and add the constraint that way. And before I do anything else, I'm going to limit the chain length to 2. And because I've already created the pole target, I'm going to add that in now. That's my IK constraint nearly working. I just need to figure out which way I need to bend the pole angle. Is it positive or negative 90? And it is positive 90. So I type that in. And then I'm testing everything and it is working. I'll add the stretch 2 constraint on the vis bone so that it goes all the way to that pole target. And then I want the deformation hand to follow along with the movement of our hand control. On the leg, I did straight parenting, but on this version, I'm just going to use a constraint. There's always more than one way of doing something, but you will see the difference that this has later on. But after I've done that, I can symmetrize the arms. Time for the arm widgets. I'm going to do both at the same time. So I'm just going to add a line to those vis bones, and I'll add a pyramid to the pole targets. And for the hand, I'm going to start out with a circle shape and then just bend it to my liking. And this is how it looks after I finish those widgets. Now here is a good place to have a little bit of a break. Make sure you congratulate yourself on getting most of the way through all the hard work. Now go and rest your brain and then join me in the second part where I continue onto the hat, the hair and the moustache components.